Welcome to Book Launch, the UK's most widely distributed books magazine for all intellectual interests. And in this podcast, we're asking, how has the prospect of a Fourth Reich shaped our hopes and fears? Even before the end of the Third Reich, while some in Germany were dreaming of a resurgent Nazism in the future, others in the West were equally mesmerised, not just politicians, but writers, academics, people in the creative arts. Why? What ideas does thinking about a Fourth Reich help us articulate, and how have these ideas changed? Gavriel Rosenfeld has charted the history of this worrying topic.
As World War II was winding down in the fall of 1944, the American-based Austrian writer Erwin Lessner published a dystopian novel called Phantom Victory that gave voice to a burgeoning fear among many people in the English-speaking world. The novel's plot was set in the years 1945 to 1960 and portrayed a humble but charismatic shepherd named Fridolin replacing Adolf Hitler as Germany's new Führer and leading the nation in a renewed bid for world power. Phantom Victory reflected growing concerns that the dangers of the recent past might return in the near future. At the time of the novel's publication, Allied forces were rapidly driving the Wehrmacht back into German territory. The novel's conclusion, however, implied that military might would not be enough to guarantee a final triumph. Unless the Allies remained vigilant about preventing the revival of Nazi ideas, the impending defeat of the Third Reich might prove fleeting, a phantom victory, and be followed by the rise of an even deadlier Fourth Reich. Lessner's narrative was one of the first to articulate a fear that has hovered over the entire post-war era. Ever since the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, a specter has haunted Western life: the specter of resurgent Nazism. Throughout Europe and North America, anxieties have persisted about unrepentant Nazis returning to power and establishing a Fourth Reich. These anxieties have been expressed not only in novels like Lessner's, but in political jeremiads, journalistic exposés, mainstream films, primetime television shows, and popular comic books. They have imagined a range of threats: political coups, terrorist attacks, and military invasions emanating from a variety of settings, including Germany, Latin America, and the United States. Fears of a Fourth Reich have fluctuated over time, swelling in certain eras and ebbing in others, but the nightmare they have envisioned has never come to pass. Thus far, the prospect of a revived Reich has remained confined to the imagination. It may initially seem pointless to examine the history of the Fourth Reich. After all, history is commonly understood as the documentation and interpretation of events that actually happened. Yet, as Hugh Trevor Roper eloquently observed more than a generation ago, history is not merely what happened, it is what happened in the context of what might have happened. It is a fact that no Fourth Reich came into being in the years following World War II. But could it have? Can reflecting on such a counterfactual question teach us anything about real history? This book suggests that the answer is yes. From today's perspective, post-war fears of a Fourth Reich appear grossly exaggerated. Germany did not descend into dictatorship after 1945. Instead, the country became a stable democracy. It is entirely appropriate, therefore, to view post-war German history as a success story. Yet doing so runs the risk of portraying the country's democratization as more or less inevitable. It implies that a Fourth Reich was destined to remain an unrealized nightmare. Whether or not this claim is true is hard to say. Until now, there has been little serious research on the subject of the Fourth Reich. As a result, historians have remained ignorant about its complex post-war history. They have generally overlooked the fact that in every phase of the Federal Republic's existence, fears persisted throughout the Western world that a new Reich was on the horizon. They have neglected to examine the reasons for these fears, and they have failed to ask, let alone answer, the question of whether these fears had any basis in reality. This latter omission is particularly problematic, for there were more than a few episodes after 1945 when Germany faced serious threats from Nazi groups seeking to return to power. All of these efforts ultimately failed, but it is worth investigating whether they might have succeeded. By revisiting these episodes and imagining scenarios in which they might have unfolded differently, we can better gauge the validity of post-war anxieties. By examining the history of what might have happened, moreover, we can better understand the memory of what actually did. The evolution of the Fourth Reich as an idea in post-war Western intellectual and cultural life reflects how people have remembered the 12-year history of the Third Reich. The idea's evolution, however, does not merely show how people have passively remembered the events of the past. It shows how they have actively employed those memories to shape the future. The fear of a Nazi return to power has long driven public efforts to prevent such a possibility from actually transpiring. The fear has galvanized people to prevent a Nazi revival not only in Germany, but anywhere in the world. Over the course of the post-war era, the Fourth Reich has become universalized into a global signifier of resurgent Nazism and fascism. In the process, the idea has functioned like a self-fulfilling prophecy in reverse. By inspiring popular vigilance, its existence in the realm of ideas has prevented its realization in reality. In order to understand this paradoxical phenomenon, it is necessary to examine the origins and evolution of the Fourth Reich in Western consciousness. In so doing, we can see how post-war history has been shaped by a specter. There has been little systematic research thus far on the Fourth Reich. As a result, most people have been exposed to the topic through sensationalistic stories in the mass media. For decades, but especially since the turn of the millennium, European newspapers in countries from Spain to Russia have warned of a Fourth Reich, none more frequently than British tabloids, which have regularly published stories with excitable headlines, such as MI5 Files, Nazis Planned Fourth Reich in Post-War Europe, and Dawn of the Fourth Reich, Why Money is Fueling New European Fears of a Dominant Germany. Similar stories have appeared in the American press, particularly since the election of Donald Trump in 2016, with one recent journalist dramatically declaring that the efforts of left-wing Antifa groups to combat the alt-right were part of a larger campaign to guard against a Fourth Reich. Further contributing to this sensationalizing trend have been non-academic studies that have linked the idea of a Fourth Reich to various global conspiracies. Books such as Jim Marrs' The Rise of the Fourth Reich, The Secret Societies That Threatened to Take Over America from 2008, and Glenn Yadin's The Nazi Hydra in America, Suppressed History of a Century, Wall Street and the Rise of the Fourth Reich, also from 2008, have made outlandish assertions that have done little to shore up the topic's claim to academic credibility. The proliferation of such sensationalistic texts helps explain why historians have shied away from studying the Fourth Reich. This is not to say that they have entirely avoided it. In fact, scholars and other writers have produced monographs, journal articles, and opinion pieces with eye-catching titles prominently featuring the phrase, the Fourth Reich. Yet, after grabbing readers' attention, these works have generally failed to explain the idea in any significant depth and show how it was perceived, used, and exploited. Similar shortcomings have marked academic studies that have mentioned but never sufficiently defined the idea of the Fourth Reich. In her book, A History of Germany, 1918 to 2008, for example, Mary Fulbrook asserted that after the end of World War II, many Germans saw the occupation by the Allies as a Fourth Reich, no better than the Third. Similarly, in his study The Nazi Legacy, Magnus Linklater declared that after 1945, the German people, totally exhausted by war and politics, thought only of survival. A kilo of potatoes mattered more than dreams of a Fourth Reich. These two passages employ very different understandings of the Fourth Reich. Yet because neither goes on to interpret the concept in any further depth, its significance remains unclear. The failure of scholars to advance our understanding of the Fourth Reich has been compounded by historians who have dismissed the concept altogether. In his book The Third Reich at War, Richard Evans flatly declared that history does not repeat itself. There will be no Fourth Reich. In The Nature of Fascism, Roger Griffin dismissed fears of a Fourth Reich in Germany as hysterical. And in The Spirit of the Berlin Republic, Dieter Detke concluded that it is inconceivable that the Berlin Republic will ever be a Fourth German Reich. These curt responses are understandable given the sensationalistic invocations of the concept, but by dismissing its seriousness, they discourage efforts to probe its deeper history. In light of how the Fourth Reich has been under-theorized and under-documented, it is high time for it to be historicized. Doing so requires uncovering the term's origins and tracing its evolution in Western intellectual, political, and cultural discourse. This task entails examining the ways that the Fourth Reich has been imagined by intellectuals, politicians, journalists, novelists, and filmmakers. It necessitates explaining how the idea's evolution has reflected broader political and cultural forces. Finally, it involves understanding how the concept relates to broader questions of history and memory. The first step towards historicizing the Fourth Reich involves...
That was an extract from the introduction to Gabriel Rosenfeld's book, The Fourth Reich, The Spectre of Nazism from World War II to the Present, published by Cambridge University Press and read here by the author. The book is available to buy at a discount and with free delivery in the UK from the Book Launch online bookshop.